Hi, everybody. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm just going to make a few introductory comments and turn it over to Colette. I know that a number of you either work here or spend a lot of time here, so I'm going to spare you the who are we, who is USIP. But what I want to say is that 20 years ago when I was working in the Balkans, we had a lot of conversations about how to do reconciliation and how do you, I'm Nancy Lindborg, by the way, for those who don't know who, here you go. How do you heal societies after the kind of terrible war and conflict that had occurred in the Balkans? And the conversation became, you have to heal at a lot of levels. And the place that we've never gotten very good at is healing at the individual level. Because when you're trying to repair a war-torn society on the basis of people who have undergone terrible, terrible traumas, you've got fundamental instability and a lot of built-in conflict within people and between people. And so that's an area that we used to call psychosocial in the humanitarian world 20 years ago. What I have become very encouraged by is the intersection that now exists between neuroscience and peace building. And 4 years ago, when we did our first USIP partnership with the Dalai Lama's office in Dharamsala, where we brought a group of youth leaders from conflict-affected countries and a group of thought leaders for a dialogue with the Dalai Lama on how do you find that inner resilience to build peace. We included a wonderful neuroscientist who I met for the first time as we arrived in New Delhi, Emile Bruneau. And Emile really gave me a deeper and different understanding of what exactly was that intersection between neuroscience and peace building. I think he greatly encouraged and enlightened and heartened 20-plus youth leaders who came from really, really terrible places, all of whom had already made the commitment to be peace builders instead of succumbing to the anger and the hate that conflict can drive an individual towards. But Emile was just extraordinary, and it was a wonderful pleasure, Emile, to meet you and be with you on that trip. The interactions that he had with the Dalai Lama were amazing because this is an area that the Dalai Lama is deeply engaged in, and I remember in the private audience that he was pulling all kinds of information out of you and wanted more and more. So I am greatly heartened to have Emile here with us today, who has really worked at the front lines of this intersection at his Peace and Conflict Neuroscience Lab. We worked with you also on the Alliance for Peace Building project, where USIP gave a grant to Alliance for Peace Building in an effort to further explore this, and Emile was one of the advisors. So it is with great pleasure that we host Emile today because he has continued to do a lot of really interesting research that I think is important to help all of us understand better how to understand that intersection. And thank you for coming down. It's really, really wonderful to see you again. And I appreciate the work that you've continued to do and the ways in which you've continued to shine that light on this issue. So thank you, Emile. And I'm going to turn it over to Colette.
Thank you, Nancy. First of all, I want to welcome everyone, and thanks so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us this afternoon. And I wanted to let you know that we are also webcasting this, and so you have a number of colleagues and friends who are watching remotely. And we've been able to, thanks to our wonderful, amazing IT team, to be able to capture this. And with Emile's permission, we will be able to put it on our website, and he's granted kindly that permission. So you can also watch it later. It'll be available on YouTube. So thank you, Emile. And just a few comments. A number of you were with us late in the spring when we had the first in our series of the Neuroscience and Peace Building Initiatives event roundtable series. That topic was on building resilient societies, and as Nancy mentioned, looking at individual and societal trauma, and what are ways that neuroscience can help social healing to build a more cohesive and peaceful society. And today's event roundtable is our second in the series, and our third one is coming up in just 3 short weeks. And it will be on epigenetics and specifically intergenerational trauma, and how does intergenerational trauma passed from individual and societies down through the chain, affect violent conflict, and also how can it impact positive peace-building measures. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Emile for his presentation, and then afterwards, Vikram, who I will introduce afterwards, just before he speaks, will provide some comments, and then we've provided ample time for discussion. So we wanted to have this a roundtable discussion so that any thoughts or questions or anything that sparks, just like the Dalai Lama wanted to delve deeper into the understanding of neuroscience and peace building through the wisdom from Emile, this will be your time to do that. So Emile, over to you.
Great. Well, it's so wonderful to be here. Thank you for coming. I look forward to talking with you at the end. I intentionally left quite a bit out of the presentation. Unfortunately, it means that a lot of these incredible people who have done this work, in particular Samantha Moorberg and Boaz Hamieri and Andres Casas, who are my collaborators and my postdocs who have been doing a lot of this research. I'm unfortunately not going to talk about a bunch of the incredible work that they've done these past few years, but hopefully it'll come up in the Q&A. So I now run this Peace and Conflict Neuroscience Lab at Penn, and I'm also the lead scientist at the Beyond Conflict Innovation Lab. But my time as a scientist, as a professional scientist, was preceded by some other time when I was actually teaching. So I was a high school and elementary school teacher for a number of years, and when I was teaching, I found myself doing what a lot of teachers do, which is save up your money during the school year and then travel during the summers. And mostly just by happenstance, I found myself in regions of conflict during times of conflict. So I was in South Africa right as it was transitioning from apartheid to democracy. I went one year to visit a friend in Sri Lanka. He was at the time just a lowly reporter, and right after I arrived at the international airport, the Tamil Tigers launched their strike on the international airport to blow it up. And as I was speeding away from the airport to visit my friend, he was speeding towards the airport to cover the event. And then I've spent some time living in the West Bank, doing research with Israelis and Palestinians. And finally, I found myself in Belfast during the Troubles. And that was actually not happenstance. That was actually intentional. I went there during the summer to volunteer for a conflict resolution program. And so here is the heartwarming photo that you would probably see in the brochure for the organization afterwards. This is me with some Catholic and Protestant kids who were eager to meet each other in Belfast, which was actually a kind of a risky thing to do at the time. You can identify the Catholic kids because they're wearing green and the Protestant kids because they're wearing blue. It's one of the ways you identify what group you're from if you're Irish. But this is not the only thing that typified this experience. In fact, a few weeks before this picture was taken, when a number of the volunteers had left, a fight broke out between two boys. And it immediately split the group down partisan lines, and there was a full-scale 300-child brawl. So I left this experience wondering what the hell we had just done, right? Do we judge the program by these kids, these dozen kids who seem to have a very positive experience, or by the 300 who seem to go backwards, right? We went in with all the best intentions, with these incredible people. We were all very dedicated. How could we have gone backwards? And it really made me think more broadly, because this is just one of the dozens and dozens of conflict resolution, reconciliation, post-conflict programs that we've been implementing as a world community really since the end of the Cold War. And so my concern was that my program wasn't just a fluke. What if the reality is that 20% of these programs backfire, 20% of them work, and 60% do nothing? Right? That would mean that after 60 years of concerted effort, that our net impact on conflict is zero. And of course, this is a discouraging possibility. And so I want to take you through the process I've gone through to try to understand how we go about peace building, and what science, and neuroscience in particular, might be able to tell us that can provide us some kind of path forward. So I'm going to speak in three different parts. The first, I'm just going to give you a brief introduction and the idea of a brain-based approach to reducing intergroup hostility. In part one, I'm going to talk about psychology beyond the most common way for us to think of what we're trying to change among people, right? Implicit bias or a general negativity towards other groups. And in part two, I'm going to talk about interventions that we can launch that go beyond just bringing people together, which is often referred to as intergroup contact. Okay, so first a question. Okay, Emile, surely you're kind of going off the handle a little bit. Surely something is better than nothing, and the hundreds of programs that we've implemented have had a net positive impact, right? Well, here's some evidence from anti-sexual violence interventions that have been implemented over the past 10 years or so. There have been 11 randomized control trials examining the impact of these anti-sexual violence interventions. What these 11 RCTs have found is that 3 of these have had net positive effects, 3 of them have had net negative effects, and 5 of them have done nothing. So in the realm of trying to reduce the endorsement of sexual violence, or how likely people are to fight against or to take any kind of action against sexual violence, there's been no net effect from the interventions that have been tested. Recently, there's been an attempt to try to decrease sexism among children, right? To decrease gender biases. The program has tried to implement the idea that girls can do anything that boys can do, right? Girls can be astronauts, girls can be lawyers and doctors. What they found is that this actually has increased gender-based bias among children. The reason being that what kids hear when they're given that intervention is girls, 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 boys, 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 girls, 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 boys, 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 right? It makes the categories more salient to the kids, and then any gender stereotypes that come along just stick to those salient categories now. Medical interventions are also not immune to this. In fact, here's something from yesterday, putting test to the test. This is revealing that a number of common medical procedures have been found to either be ineffective or counterproductive And this wasn't just a few of them. This is 130 different common medical procedures. So this is endemic in many different fields. And I think what we can take away from this is that our good intentions and our intuitions is not enough. And just because we have really skilled people, it doesn't mean that we're going to have a positive outcome. Okay, so how do we reduce intergroup conflict? I think that the dominant approach that we've taken as a world community has been the safe choice, right? Intergroup contact. If we get people from warring or opposing groups together for positive exchanges, that good things will happen. And this is based on good science, right? It's based on the contact hypothesis, which is articulation 60 years ago by Gordon Allport, basically saying that contact will reduce prejudice between groups when you have equal status between groups, when they have common goals, when there's cooperation, when the authorities support it. And this was based on some really high-profile anecdotal evidence coming from the 1920s to the 1950s. There were a number of kind of accidental or forced integration programs, like the Merchant Marines during World War II, police forces in the 1950s, public housing that was either racially segregated in New York or racially integrated in New Jersey. It provided these kind of naturalistic experiments to see what happens to, in particular, to the white people in this situation and their attitudes towards black people. Does their prejudice reduce? And in a lot of these situations, it did seem that white people became more tolerant and less prejudiced if they were kind of forced into these integration situations. And now there have been thousands of experiments that have been done over the last 60 years, and this is a meta-analysis of these experiments that's been very influential, that was published about 10 years ago by Linda Tropp. And what this shows is that 94% of these experiments showed a positive relationship between positive contact and decreased prejudice. So you can see the negative, that's the R value. So how big was the correlation? R values go from +1, there's a perfect correlation, to -1, which is there's a perfect negative correlation. That is, -1 would mean the more positive contact you have, the less prejudice you have. Right? And that relationship would be perfect. So another step in more positive contact would be a step down in prejudice. Okay, so this does show that across all these thousands of studies that that there was this trend towards a positive effect. That is, less prejudice in people who had more contact, a negative correlation. Okay. But this is where I want to start being a little bit critical of this, because I think that the intergroup contact has so dominated both the scientific literature and policy that it has kind of squashed away other efforts. It squashed away our ingenuity in figuring out if anything else can be better. And I would argue that intergroup contact might not be the safe choice, because there are some benefits, reliable positive effects, but there are some really severe limitations. Here's one. The effects are really weak, right? A correlation of 0.2 means there's a huge amount of variability in how much prejudice people have. If we know how much positive contact they've had with the other group, that only allows us to explain 4% of the variability in prejudice out there. That is terrible, right? It doesn't account for 96% of the variability. So to my mind, relying on that is pretty weak. Okay, number two, it's incredibly resource intensive to run face-to-face contact programs. You have to bring people together. You have to have trained facilitators. So you have to have a location. You have to have the people. If there are groups that are actually in conflict, you have to broker this maybe at a third party, right? So Seeds of Peace is a really common, really popular program. It's up in Maine. They fly Israelis and Palestinians out to Maine to do a camp for a couple of weeks. Right, man, that is so resource intensive. It's very self-selecting, right? It has to be people who want to engage with the other side. And so the reach is incredibly limited. You're reaching tens, or maybe, if you have a really big program, hundreds of people in a year, right? And the research from this meta-analysis shows that the effects are quite short-lasting. If they look even 10 days out, most of these programs aren't showing any effects anymore, right? So they're generally on the order of 24 hours. So it's a very limited effect for having a self-selecting group that's really resource intensive. It's also true that these programs tend to be much more beneficial to the majority group members. If you bring a bunch of black kids and white kids together, yeah, it might decrease white kids' prejudice towards black kids, but it's basically doing nothing for the black kids, right? They might say, okay, well, I decrease the prejudice of some white kids, but for them, it's not really doing much. And in fact, there might be a negative effect for marginalized group members if it sets up expectations that are then violated. So this seems to be true, for example, of the qualitative research of a place like Seeds of Peace. The Palestinian kids afterwards might have their expectations inflated about the relationship now between Israelis and Palestinians. But what they find is that when they go home and they go through a checkpoint for the first time, expecting something a little bit different, they encounter the same thing they encountered before. And now, rather than just feeling annoyed, right, they feel betrayed because their trust has been increased and now it's broken. And so this is the story that I heard from a number of Palestinian youth. Okay, so I would argue intergroup contact, not that it's bad, right, but that it's limited. It has some really severe limitations for the number of people who it can reach, and even those people it can reach, the effects are reasonably weak, short-lasting, and it might have a negative effect for some of the participants in the program. Right? Finally, it can backfire. The fact that increased positive contact decreases prejudice, right? The corollary is also true. Increased negative contact increases prejudice. So if a kid goes to a face-to-face contact program and has a negative experience with another kid, right, he's going to come out of that program with a worse attitude towards the other side. Okay, so what I want to do now is provide to you kind of the perspective that I have now after once I left this conflict resolution program. I came back to the US, and pretty soon afterwards I enrolled myself into a PhD neuroscience program because I felt like one area of science that could potentially help us better understand why people get into conflict and hopefully how to get out of it is to better understand the human brain. Because one observation I made across these very different conflicts is that even though they were different in every way, right, different religions, different cultures, different ethnicities, different languages, different histories, the processes that seemed to be driving conflict were eerily similar. I felt like I could take the transcript of a conversation with a Tamil kid in a village, and I could give it to a kid in Belfast and have him read it, and it would make complete sense to him. Right? So one thing we hold in common is the human brain. And if we can find something that's very common happening in the human brain, then maybe we can unlock some similar processes, interventions that can work similarly across different conflicts. Okay, so here was my naive view of the human brain, right, before I entered a neuroscience program. The human brain has a role, that is to take in information from the world as inputs, and that guides our behavior, what we do as outputs. And my naive view was that the brain's job was to give us as accurate and high fidelity readout of the world as possible, right? That would be the ideal. And that anything that deviated from that was pathology. And what I learned pretty quickly in a neuroscience program was that is actually precisely false. That our brains are not designed to give us an accurate readout of the world. Our brains are designed to give us information that allows us to act quickly. And so they are riddled with priors. These are assumptions our brain has about the world, with heuristics. These are shortcuts and biases. And we can reveal some of these in a fun way in the visual cortex through what we call visual illusions, right, or optical illusions. So here is one optical illusion. So hopefully all of you can see this, right? One illusion is that these are two-dimensional shapes. They're circles, but they look like they're three-dimensional. Some of them look like they're little dimples going into the board, and some of them look like little bumps coming out of the board, right? And there's a particular illusion with this image because one of the little circles looks different than the others, right? You can see one of them. So actually raise your hand if you think that the one that looks different from the others is a bump coming out of the board. Okay, good. Yes, your visual systems are all working as a normal human's visual system should, which is if there is a circle and it's shaded on the bottom and lit on the top, your brain assumes that is a little bump coming out of the board. And the reason your brain does that is your brain assumes that the main light source that it's going to encounter is going to be from above, the sun. So if something is lit on the top and shaded on the bottom, that would be a bump coming out of the board. And if it's a little cave, right, if it's a dimple going in, then a light source from above would light the bottom of it and the top would be shaded like the others. Right, and I can show you that it's your brain doing this and not the image, because if we take this image and flip it upside down, now the one dot that looks different from the others now looks like a cave, right, and not a dimple coming out. Okay, so, or not a bump coming out. Okay, here's another one. This is just a really simple one. This looks like a very boring rectangle, gray rectangle. If you have really good visual acuity, you might see that there's a very slight gradation across it, that the left side is slightly brighter than the right side. Okay, that gradation is very subtle. I know because I made it in Photoshop. So it's a subtle gradation, but here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to cut this rectangle in half, and I'm going to put the left side next to the right side. And now what we can see is that the left and the right that are right next to each other, they look very different, right? It's unmistakable now that the left side is much lighter than the right side. I didn't do anything to the image, right? All I did is I moved it so that the contrast is enhanced. And what your brain does is it automatically enhances all contrasts it encounters in the world. And it does this so that I can pick out objects, object in front from an object behind. I can see that this is multiple people. So your brain is automatically doing this in the background all the time. And here's one more that I don't even need to describe to you. You will probably recognize it. Our brains see faces in objects. Obviously, these aren't actually faces, but if you see two dots and a line, your brain turns it into a face. So one interesting thing about this is that these things are happening all the time without your awareness or endorsement. This is just basically Photoshop acting in your brain all the time in the background. And this illustrates something interesting about the human brain. And a favorite analogy of the human brain is that it's like a rider sitting on top of an elephant, that the rider represents a very small portion of your brain that you're actually consciously aware of. whereas the elephant represents the vast majority of processes that are going on in your brain, but which you are, that are below your conscious awareness, so you're not aware of the processes all the time. So these visual illusions are examples of some of these biases that are happening below the surface without your endorsement or awareness. Okay, but the question remains, our brains see things that aren't there. Our brains don't see some things that are there. It accentuates some features and completely ignores others. Why? Why is this happening? Well, it's a really easy explanation for these optical illusions. That is that these illusions allow our brains to see this as a lion in the grass. If you ask a computer what this is, it'll have a really difficult time recognizing this. Computers are very literal. You have to program them with particular biases before they're able to see this as a lion in the grass. So brains that are not able to see this as a lion in the grass, or that do it very slowly and deliberately, they are eaten. Brains that see this really quickly as a lion in the grass are not eaten. And this is why all of our brains do this very quickly and automatically, right? Because all of our ancestors did it effectively. Okay, so these illusions in our brains are not limited just to the visual system. We also have illusions when we're thinking about groups, for example. And one of the most fundamental of these, what we might call social illusions, is the illusion of tribalism. So tribalism is the tendency to think not just in terms of me and you, but to think in terms of us and them. And this tendency is so strong that psychologists have done all these wonderful devious studies where they will take a room of people and they'll arbitrarily split the room in half, and they'll have half the room wear a red shirt and half the room wear blue shirt, and they'll just see what happens. And what they find is that the people in the red shirts will start congregating with each other. They'll start talking with each other. And when you ask them to make inferences about red shirters and blue shirters, people in red shirts will be more likely to trust someone else if they're wearing a red shirt. If they're asked to distribute things among the group, they'll distribute more resources to red shirters than blue shirters. They'll think that red shirters are more attractive and more intelligent than blue shirters. And this is true even if you tell them at the outset that the designation is completely arbitrary. Right? Our brains just have a tendency to fall into this tribal mentality, and once they do, other biases come online. One of these biases is called the fundamental attribution error. This is that if someone from our group does something bad, we tend to attribute it to the situation. My group member was speeding because they had an important meeting to get to, right? Of course. Why else would they be speeding? But someone from the other group speeding, they're speeding because they're a maniac, right? It's something about who they are. And this was just so beautifully illustrated in the run-up to the 2016 election, when it was discovered that Hillary Clinton had government emails on her private email server. Right? It was very, very easy for Clinton supporters to chalk that up to the situation, right? It was an honest mistake, right? But Hillary Clinton's detractors had a very different interpretation of that, right? They saw it as a window into her soul, right? It was an indication of who she was. And on the other side, when the Access Hollywood tapes came out, it was really easy for Trump supporters to come up with a situational description for why that happened, right? It's just locker room talk. Whereas Trump detractors saw it as, again, a window into his soul. Right? And this is not to say that any one of these ideas is correct or not. Right? I have my own views about this. It's just to say that our brains are pushed in that direction. Here's another one, motive attribution. Not only do we make attributions about others' actions, we make attributions about their intentions. We assume that our actions, the actions of members of our group, are motivated by love for our group members, by patriotism, right? Whereas we assume the other group is motivated by hatred towards us. Right? So why were the attacks on 9/11 perpetrated? Right? Because they hate us. Right? They hate us for our freedoms. Why does Pat Tillman sign up for the American military? Why does he leave playing NFL and sign up for the military? Because he's patriotic, because he loves America, right? This is, again, just an attribution that we automatically make. And of course, both groups can't be right in this attribution, right? So the reality is that we basically have like a filter in our brains, right? Like the filter you have on a phone when you take a photo, right? And for one group, if you're considering members of your own group, that filter just gives you a slightly benevolent view of the actions and intentions and characteristics of your group members. Whereas if you're considering a member of the other group, it gives you a slightly malevolent view. And so what you're left with is an image, again, that doesn't match reality. It just, it's based explicitly on bias that we have in our brain, or actually implicitly on bias. These are biases that we're not necessarily aware of, but they inform how we behave. Okay, so the assumption of intergroup contact programs is that there is a vague negativity felt towards another group. Right? And that the way that you can get rid of this vague negativity is if you have repeated positive interactions with a member of the other group, right? That you can counteract the many, many negative experiences, either personal or vicarious, that a member of one group has had with another group by giving them a bunch of positive experiences. And this is just repetition training. There's another approach, though, which is maybe it's not just about a bunch of negative experiences that you've had over time. We might be able to challenge these things more directly. So let me give you an alternate view that follows from this idea that we build up these specific negative perceptions about other group members because of the biases in our brains. Right? So what this might give you is, instead of just a vague negativity about another group, this might give you very specific negative perceptions about the other group. They hate us for our freedoms, right? They are coming here to change our culture. They mean to do us harm. All of these are very specific ideological views that all kind of can hang together into a view about another group. And we have these about many other groups. You can think about the specific views that are racist towards black people in the United States, right? There's a whole kind of ideology that can be built up around it. Why haven't black people just gotten over the past? Why can't they pull themselves up by their bootstraps? My parents worked really hard for what they got. Why can't they work really hard? These are ideological arguments. It's not just a vague negativity. They're very specific beliefs that can be fed by our natural biases. And they can also be fed by others, right? They can be tweaked. Okay, so what I want to suggest is that one way to combat negativity towards groups is by kind of this repetition, by giving them a bunch of positive experiences with another side. But there's another way. There's a way that we can combat bias that isn't just about this implicit general negativity. And there are interventions that we can implement that are beyond contact. Okay, so I'm going to talk in these two parts. The first part will be trying to measure bias beyond just this general negativity. And the other part will be talking about interventions. How do we intervene beyond just bringing people together? Okay, first, a cautionary tale based on Rosemary Kennedy. Measuring success. How we measure things really matters. And here's my cautionary tale about getting the measurement right. The prefrontal lobotomy was a technique to treat people who were schizophrenic, people who had violent outbursts. It involved sticking a modified ice pick underneath someone's eye socket and wiggling it back and forth to cut all the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the rest of the brain. This was used with Rosemary Kennedy. She had bipolar disorder, and this was used with thousands of people. This was considered a wild success by the measure that was used at the time. It was such a success that the guy that developed this won the Nobel Prize in medicine in the 1940s. So I would say that the problem wasn't that it was a success, it was their measure of success they were using. Right? If the measure of success is a decrease in violent outbursts, yes, severing the prefrontal cortex from the rest of the brain very effectively decreases violent outbursts. But my point would be that that's the wrong measure of success. If you use the wrong measure of success, you might find that something is successful when in fact it isn't. So getting the measure of success right is really important. We now, of course, also use things like quality of life as a measure for medical interventions. For example, for interventions, anti-cancer, interventions for Alzheimer's and for schizophrenia, right? It matters what effect it has on somebody. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about three different perceptions that go beyond just general negativity that I've been examining a lot lately, that have mostly been informed by people in the field, people who are actually experiencing hostility, members of marginalized groups. These are dehumanization, meta-perceptions, which is how you think another group thinks of your group, and then collective blame, how much you collectively blame an entire group for the actions of individuals. Okay, so first, dehumanization. Dehumanization historically has been associated with some of the darkest chapters in human history, right? From colonization to genocide to war. And kind of theoretically, this makes sense because dehumanization is thought to morally disengage people from harming others. We have a lot of prohibitions. Human society have prohibitions against harming others, but those prohibitions are predicated on the assumption that the other is human. If they're no longer human, we no longer have those prohibitions. In fact, non-human animals we regularly slaughter for sport, for fun, for food. But dehumanization isn't just a relic of the past. We see examples of it all the time today. Here's an image from a newspaper a few years ago of Iranians being depicted as cockroaches scurrying down a drain, Muslim immigrants being depicted as rats crossing a border from a newspaper in England, and ISIS being depicted as cancer with, of course, a weapon as the cure. And here is, I think, the most chilling example that I have encountered recently. This is a quote from Zsolt Bayer, who's the founder of Hungary's current ruling party. A significant number of the Roma population are not fit to live among people. These Roma are animals. They behave like animals. They're incapable of human communication. Inarticulate sounds pour out of their bestial skulls. These animals should not be allowed to exist in no way. That needs to be solved immediately and regardless of the method. Right, so this is totally chilling because it takes us right back to the 1930s, but it's not the 1930s, and it's not a hot mic moment. This is an editorial that was published in one of Hungary's leading newspapers just a few years ago. Right, so these perceptions seem to still be commonplace in Western societies. But interestingly, we in psychology didn't think that dehumanization was strong enough to actually measure. And even if it was strong enough in American societies, we didn't think that people would actually cop to it. We, meaning me and a colleague, Noor Kataili, we thought that it might be worth at least trying to see if people would admit to blatantly dehumanizing other groups. So we came up with this incredibly offensive measure of dehumanization that very simply provides people with the ascent of man diagram inspired by evolution. and list groups underneath, and then just ask people to move the little slider over until it indicates how evolved and civilized they feel each of these groups are. And here are the responses, the average responses from a representative sample of Hungarians. What you'll see is Hungarians consider Hungarians and Transylvanians as very high on this scale, but Muslims and the Roma to be much lower. In fact, if we just convert it to a 100-point scale, they would say that the Roma and Muslims are about 30 points lower on this scale than Hungarians. Okay, so this is the difference score in Hungary, 29 points. We've now done this all around Europe, and in fact, Hungary isn't the leader in this particular racism competition. That award so far goes to the Czech Republic, where there's a 39-point difference between what Czech people report for their own group versus the Roma. And it's not just limited to the Roma population. So first of all, one shocking result is the mean difference, but importantly, we also want to know if people who report more dehumanization are more likely to report or more likely to engage in discrimination towards the Roma, right? So not only is the perception there, but does it matter? And we found that indeed, if you consider like soft discrimination, so this might be things like your opposition to affirmative action programs. Indeed, if people dehumanize the Roma more, then they are more opposed to affirmative action programs. But dehumanization is particularly well correlated with things that we might consider hard discrimination. This is like asking people, how in favor are you of a program that offers Roma women free birth control, but the birth control also causes permanent sterilization? For these types of programs, now dehumanization is a very strong predictor. And importantly, it predicts even if you take into account how conservative they are and how much prejudice they hold towards the Roma, how much they dislike the Roma. So it's something beyond just dislike. We've also looked at this during the refugee crisis in Europe, and indeed, dehumanization of refugees was very comparable to what it is towards the Roma. And again, the degree of blatant dehumanization expressed was nicely correlated with the number of refugees people thought should be granted asylum into their country, their support for pro-refugee policies, and their willingness to actually sign petitions to this effect. And of course, it's not just a European phenomenon. We looked at dehumanization in the US of Iranians during the negotiations for the nuclear deal during Obama administration. This is about when this cartoon came out of Iranians as cockroaches scurrying down a drain. And indeed, we found that there was a mean level of dehumanization of Iranians in the US. And again, we found that the level of dehumanization was actually a really strong predictor of people's support for war, their opposition to the nuclear accord, and again, their willingness to sign petitions. And in fact, dehumanization was the strongest predictor. Once you took dehumanization into account, conservatism and prejudice didn't even predict anymore. Right? So dehumanization has been this strong predictor in many different contexts, but is it just an expression of dislike? Right? Sure, you give people this scale. Maybe they're just using it as a way to say, I really dislike this group. Or alternately, is it something different? Is it completely different evaluation? So one way that we decided to try to evaluate this was to put people in a scanner and look at their brains while they were making these judgments. And the intuition here is that, well, if people, when they're making dehumanization judgments, are using the same brain regions as when they're making dislike judgments, then maybe it's just they're both the same thing, right? Maybe dehumanization is like extreme dislike. But if they're making these judgments and while they're making the judgments, they're using completely different brain regions, then that suggests that these might be different processes. So what we did is we had people in the scanner evaluate these groups: Americans, Europeans, surgeons, Muslims, gypsies, the pejorative for the Roma, homeless, and then actual animals. And we had them rate them on two different scales. One, this dehumanization scale, and the other, a dislike scale. And you'll note here that some of these groups are high-status human groups, and some of them are low-status human groups, and some of them, again, are animals. And what we found is a couple of brain regions that responded more when people were making greater judgments of dehumanization. The more they rated them to be less human, the more activity we got in these regions. And they're only on the left side of the brain. And if we look at the average response in these brain regions, we find that, as we would expect, they respond more towards animals, less towards low-status groups, and even less towards high-status groups. And importantly, if we look at the brain region that responds to judgments of liking and dislike, it's a completely different brain region. It's in the center of the brain rather than on the side, called the posterior cingulate cortex. Right? And so the brain region that's responding to dislike is totally insensitive when people are making the dehumanization judgments. And when people are making dehumanization judgments, those brain regions are totally insensitive when people are making dislike judgments. So this is what we call a double dissociation in the brain. Okay, so this is all to say that dehumanization is a process that we can measure that's strongly associated with behaviors and intentions in many different contexts. Another of these psychological processes that I've been involved in studying is something called meta-perceptions. The reason that I've been really interested in this is there's actually a lot of previous research showing that the degree to which people dislike another group is largely based on how they think the other group thinks of their group. If you think another group hates your group, you hate their group as well. And we thought this might actually be true, particularly for dehumanization. If you feel like the other group dehumanizes you, you might dehumanize them in turn. Right? And the rhetoric for this has been quite strong, again, especially towards Muslim groups. They hate us. In particular, they hate us exactly for the things that we feel are most human about us, right? So we assessed meta-dehumanization and meta-prejudice just by asking Americans, how much do you think Iranians dehumanize and dislike Americans? And we found that indeed, their answers on both of these things predicted how much they would endorse aggression towards Iran. And they would do it, as we would expect, by increasing their dehumanization and increasing their prejudice. Okay, so in sum, across 12 countries, in many more than 10,000 participants, blatant dehumanization has predicted every single real-world outcome we've ever put in our surveys. It does it controlling for prejudice and conservatism, and it seems to be driven by meta-perceptions, by how we think the other group thinks of us. Okay, so now talking about interventions that can go beyond just intergroup contact. So again, if vague negativity is the thing that we're trying to combat, vague negativity that's built up over many, many iterations of negative perceptions of other groups, our experiences with them, then we might be able to combat those with many, many positive experiences. But if we have a whole set of assumptions about another group, some very specific perceptions about another group, these specific beliefs might not be addressed just by positive interactions with the other group. They might be better addressed by directly going to the source. And we call these interventions that make people aware of the biases that they hold, that they might not be aware that they hold. We call these collectively wise interventions, or making people wise to the biases that they hold. So I want to give you a couple of examples of wise interventions that we collectively have developed recently that I think show a lot of promise, in particular in the field. Okay, the first one I'm going to present was not my doing. This is Boaz Hamieri's work. Boaz is a postdoc in my lab who's a newly minted professor now, heading off to Tel Aviv University in a year and a half. He did an intervention that I think was very clever. So the idea of the intervention was to reveal to Israelis some of the absurdity of their views using a technique called reductio ad absurdum. This is a debate technique where you take someone's position and you take it to kind of the caricature of its extreme. An example of this is a modest proposal by Swift, right? This was written during Victorian times, and he wrote this modest proposal, which was to, the rich were complaining about the lower classes, and he said, well, why don't we solve this? Why don't we make the lower classes actually useful to the upper classes by grinding them up and using them for fertilizer for food? Then they'd be useful. Right, so it was, of course, a tongue-in-cheek, reductio ad absurdum to shock the higher classes into actually thinking about the views that they hold. And Boaz did this in Israel to try to get the most hawkish Israelis to actually deliberately think about their positions. And here's what he did. He created this intervention that he called Paradoxical Thinking. It was a whole campaign that was developed. It had videos. It had slogans. And the idea was to present to Israelis the following argument. We are the most moral people in the world, and what makes us moral is the conflict. Therefore, to increase our morality, we should accelerate the conflict. Right? So it's a logical argument that's taken to its absurd extremes. And what he found is if he presented people with different variations of this, again, in a very clever way, developed by an advertising firm with Israeli participants, that if he did this over time, and he did this actually as a randomized trial, he did it in one Israeli city, and he had a control Israeli city where he didn't launch it, and then he compared across these two cities. What he found was when he ran this as a 9-wave survey over time, and he presented one group with 5-minute video containing commercials that were paradoxical thinking mixed in with regular commercials, and the other group, the control group, he just presented them with 6 random commercials. What he found was that the paradoxical thinking group decreased their perception that Palestinians were exclusively responsible for the conflict. And over time, it increases Israelis' willingness to compromise with Palestinians. Right, so again, this is a randomized control trial, a field study between 2 different Israeli cities, and just by presenting them with this kind of paradoxical thinking intervention, it was enough to cause them to kind of shake their resistance to compromise with Palestinians. Another intervention that I've developed recently is based on the hypocrisies that we hold. And these hypocrisies are, again, inevitable. Right? This is just part of who we are. We have these social illusions, and this leads us to judge groups by different standards. I wanted to see if I could develop an intervention that could decrease Islamophobia. Of course, Islamophobia is on the rise in the U.S. and across the Western world. And so I developed what I call a collective blame hypocrisy intervention. So I wanted in particular to combat this tendency to collectively blame all Muslims for the actions of individual Muslim extremists, as typified here by a Rupert Murdoch tweet. Maybe most Muslims are peaceful, but until they recognize and destroy their growing jihadist cancer, they must be held responsible. And the problem with collective blame is that it leads people, if you blame all the members of the other group, then you can exact your retribution against any member of the other group, right? It allows vicarious retribution. As the Tsarnaev brothers, for example, they said that the attacks, the Boston Marathon attacks, were retribution for American intervention overseas, even though all the victims of the attack were not American service members. Right? And of course, if Americans hold Muslims collectively to blame, then you might see an increase in hate crimes or hate speech after an act of aggression. And indeed, that's what we see in the US, right? Spikes of hate speech and hate crime after an individual act of violence. Okay, so the intervention, so first of all, my assumption was that people would blame Muslims for an individual act of Muslim violence. Indeed, they do on a 100-point scale. The blame is about 35 points. But if I asked a separate group of Americans, how much do you blame Christians for an individual act of Christian violence, they answer about 10 on the scale, right? So this is just verifying that we do hold this hypocrisy. I think this is an opportunity, right? People don't like being hypocritical. If you point out their hypocrisies, they experience something called cognitive dissonance, and we like to resolve our hypocrisies. And so I thought if we could do it gently enough, we might be able to get people to resolve their hypocrisies by decreasing how much they blame Muslims. And this is how I do it. I give people the one-sentence description of Dylan Roof, right? A white guy who goes into a black church and murders the 9 black parishioners who invited him in for a prayer service. Then I ask people to report how responsible they think white Americans are for what Dylan Roof did on a little slider from not at all to completely, and how responsible they think they are for what Dylan Roof did. I do it for another couple of white supremacists like Anders Breivik, the Norwegian guy who killed a bunch of children, Wade Page, this guy who killed a bunch of Sikhs thinking they were Muslim. How responsible do you think Christians are for the 50 cross burnings a year that still happen in the United States? And then I switch it over and I start asking about individual Muslims, like Muniba, a Muslim woman who owns a small bakery in southern France. How responsible do you think she was for the attacks in Paris in 2015? Or how responsible was Ahmed or Tariq? And then I ask how responsible are Muslims in general for this attack in Paris that killed 130 people. And here are the results. For people in a control condition who I just ask, how responsible are Muslims in general for this individual act committed by a Muslim extremist, they say about 35 points on a 100-point scale. For people who go through this little activity, here's how they respond. Right? For white people, about 10 points. Christians, about 10 points. Me, well, of course not. How could I be held responsible? Well, if I'm not responsible, then how can individual Muslims be held responsible? And then when I ask about Muslims, they answer about the same as the other groups. Right, so this is a pretty big effect, right? From 35 points down to 10 points. I've done this also, in support of the House of Cards idea, not only does it affect their collective blame of Muslims, but their support for anti-Muslim behavior goes down as well. So their endorsement of a ban on Muslims coming into the United States, or support for anti-Sharia laws, things like this. I've also done this in Spain. It was even stronger effect in Spain, from 40 points down to 10 points. And in Spain, I came back and checked with the same participants 1 month later. The effect remained. I checked back with them again a year later, and the effect was still there. Right? After a 1-minute activity, the effect was still there. Right? And not only was the effect still there for how much they blame Muslim, but the effect was still there for their support for anti-Muslim policies. And this isn't just an effect that works for Muslims and violence. I've done this also asking people to consider how responsible the African American community is for inner city drug problems. People will say almost 50 on a 100-point scale. But if I take a group of people and first ask them, well, how responsible is the white community for this white couple that OD'd on opioids with their child in the back seat, or this white mother who overdosed on opioids with her child in the back seat, or this white couple that overdosed while visiting their child in the hospital. Right, so how responsible, again, is the white community? How responsible are you? If I take them through that activity and then ask them how responsible is the African American community, right, it's cut down to about a third. Okay, so this is just to say it works in multiple contexts. It works if you're addressing different groups, right? And again, this is not repeated exposure over months and months, right? This is what we call one-shot learning, right? In neuroscience, you can have repetition learning, but the human brain is capable of learning something after experiencing it a single time. And so it's just taking advantage of that ability of the human brain. Okay, so finally, I just want to give you how it can all come together in an intervention that I recently developed in Colombia. So Colombia, a few years ago, Colombia, the government and the FARC, the rebel group that has been fighting against the government for about 60 years, managed to sign a peace treaty ending 60 years of conflict that has killed over 250,000 people. They then put the peace treaty to the public in a public referendum, and the public rejected it, right, by a very narrow margin, but they rejected it. And so now they're in this very tenuous place. A Colombian grad student approached me and asked me if he thought we could develop an intervention in Colombia that could push the Colombian public towards accepting peace rather than perpetuating war. And so what we did is first we got intuitions from practitioners on the ground about what types of psychological processes might be driving conflict. And then we as scientists in collaboration with filmmakers developed an intervention and tested it. So this is kind of this closed circuit of science that's informed by boots on the ground, and that then create science that's actually applicable to practitioners in the field. So this occurred in Colombia. What we did first is we supplied an online survey to a representative sample of Colombians just to ask what types of perceptions seem to be most strongly associated with Colombians' opposition to peace. And what we found was that there were a number of meta-perceptions, beliefs of what was inside the heads of FARC members. These were strongly correlated with people's opposition to peace. So although dehumanization was quite high in Colombia, even a better predictor than dehumanization of opposition to peace were these meta-perceptions. And not only did they predict opposition to peace, but they predicted people's willingness to sign a petition to terminate the peace treaty. So what we did with that is I went with this Colombian grad student and a filmmaker to a FARC demobilization camp. So as part of the peace deal with FARC, the FARC organization has agreed to demobilize into 26 different locations around the country, and they're now guarded by a military brigade and a police cordon, and they're next to a neighboring village. And so we went to one of these places, and the idea was to interview FARC members to see if what they actually believed was different from what people think FARC members believe. We thought that if we could challenge people's meta-perceptions, that we might be able to kind of knock down this house of cards that people had built up. And so let me just show you a couple minutes of this video that we created. The video, well, you'll see.
Él está viendo ahora que llegó al espacio que ustedes tienen acá una comunidad cerca, pero también está la policía, están los militares. ¿Cómo ha sido ese relacionamiento con ellos? ¿Ha sido difícil? ¿Ha sido fácil?
Al principio fue un poco complicado, porque todo el mundo tenía sus temores. Se fue construyendo esos lazos de amistad, de entendimiento, y todo fue gradualmente, pero fue avanzando. Hasta ahora, pues, creo que hay una muy buena relación, tanto con la comunidad, tanto con el ejército, tanto con la policía.
Pues una de las cosas, primero que todo, es la confianza, o sea, de entrar en confianza, porque la realidad, lo que hemos tenido aquí, la confianza y la integración, porque nosotros no le hemos podido dar nada, más nada. Confianza, integración y amor, afecto, cariño a las comunidades.
Ellos dicen, ¿cuántos de nosotros no queremos que nos muevan de aquí? Porque aquí nosotros venimos, jugamos fútbol con ustedes.
Nos dijeron que hay un equipo de fútbol.
Sí, aquí hay un fútbol mixto.
Claro, mixto.
Sí, policía, soldados, comunidad y excombatientes. Ya se organizó el equipo de fútbol de mujeres. Ya fueron y jugaron en Dabeiba y derrotaron al equipo de allá.
No, hemos trabajado muy de la mano, actividades, arreglada de camino, arregla de carreteras, que una ayuda para una señora pobre allí, que hay que hacer una rifa.
Okay, so what we found in interviewing these ex-combatants is that within 2 months of demobilizing and disarming and coming down to this camp, that they had formed a mixed soccer team that involved FARC members, members of the police, military, and local villagers, that the road had washed out, and FARC had organized a team of people from all these groups to rebuild the road for the whole area, that they had organized raffles and bingos to raise money for the poor villagers in the neighboring village, right? That everything that they were saying was in opposition to the specific meta-perception Colombians held that FARC members were unwilling to integrate into Colombian society. Right? And not only did the FARC members say this, but then we interviewed the villagers and the police and the NGO workers, and they all said, yeah, that's all true. Right? So they corroborated everything that the FARC members said. And so what we did then is we just did a randomized control trial. We had some Colombians watch this video, and then and some Colombians serve as a control group, and we asked afterwards, how willing do you think FARC members are to integrate? And people who watched the video were much less willing to endorse this idea that FARC is unwilling to integrate. These effects lasted 3 months later, so they watched the video just once, and we checked in 3 months later. It also decreased their dehumanization of FARC members. This is, in fact, the strongest dehumanization intervention we've ever tried, right? It knocked it in half. And importantly, it also durably increased their support for peace. And we've since replicated this effect in a brand new group of Colombians. So I'm going to stop here. I'm sorry, I've gone over my time, but I just wanted to present here this idea that we have this idea of vague negativity that's built up towards a group, and that we can combat this with direct contact programs. That's fine, but these programs have a big drawback, right? They cost a lot of money. They're really resource intensive. They don't have a big reach. And this is just exploring an alternative approach, wise interventions that can specifically target the perceptions towards another group that are driving behavior towards that group, and that these can be much more efficient, right? That their reach can be in the tens of thousands. In fact, what we're doing right now is trying to launch this as a featurette before feature-length films in Colombia and test in moviegoers. And this could affect thousands and thousands of Colombians. The effect size is a little bit larger with these WISE interventions that I've presented to you as compared to the intergroup contact interventions. The duration is longer, and so the investment per person is much lower than the direct contact programs. But we also don't necessarily have to think of them in opposition to each other. We could think that you could correct some of these perceptions with a pre-intervention through like this media piece for the people who are eventually going to face be in these face-to-face contact programs. So you could think of the WISE interventions as a pre-intervention before the kind of on-the-ground face-to-face interventions. Okay, so I will finish there. Thank you so much for the attention. I look forward to chatting a little bit more.
Thanks so much, Emile, for your very thought-provoking discussion of your research and your findings, and especially capping it off with the interventions. And it's very exciting to think about a way, as you say, that can have much greater reach and a way of scaling up what some of the more traditional methods, while can be useful, simply cannot meet the demand and the reach. So thanks so much, and I'm sure there will be a lot of questions and discussion around your comments. So I'd like to turn it now to Vikram. Vikram is going to provide some concluding remarks. He is a senior advisor with our Asia program, so he, I think, will be talking about the importance and applicability to actual conflicts that we're dealing with, and the field reality of what we're talking about with intergroup conflict and biases, and how that can fuel wars and deeper societal divisions.
Thank you, Colette, and thank you, Emile, and thank you, Nancy. I know you're going to have to slip away, so we will proceed. Because we're running late, and I imagine people want to be able to ask questions, perhaps about particular conflicts that they work on strategies they're trying to implement. How, to me, the intersection of practitioner to science that we've seen from Emile is something that I think is really unique in our field. We're in a field that's based a lot on gut, and I don't know how many people know, but so Emile and I basically been talking conflict with one another since we were toddlers, because we actually went to preschool together. So I'm the journalist he was visiting in Sri Lanka the day of that terrorist attack, and it's just an interesting twist of fate that I ended up on the policy side of conflict, war, and peace issues in my professional life, and he ended up on the science side. And if there's one thing I know from my personal experience, is that my side, the policy side, has rarely been informed by scientific thinking. We don't really have mechanisms for doing what Colette and Nancy have made possible here at USIP very often. And so I really commend the work that you guys are doing, and Colette, what your team is doing to try to bring this into the mainstream and help the family of practitioners, that is a lot of the folks in this room, start drawing on, learning from these scientific breakthroughs that Emile and so many other neuroscientists are making every year. I've been hearing these stories from the time Emile first put kids that have gone through Seeds of Peace programs into functional MRI machines a long time ago, to see, do they have things changed in their brains based on going through these programs, and have sort of watched as I've seen them have, say, the scales fall away from their eyes and say, okay, let's be realistic about these outcomes. What are other ways to approach things? And when we talked last year about the work on meta-narratives, I just found his initial results really stunning, right? The fact that first, short interventions could that quickly change the way respondents would react to, for example, group blame, right? How that was worked with African Americans, worked with, do you blame Muslims? And then the fact that it seems that after a month or even a year, that impact is still holding. That I wouldn't have expected that at all. And so instead of me talking about how this applies, I think it's pretty obvious, whether you're dealing with Myanmar or Afghanistan or Colombia, it's pretty obvious that this could be a powerful avenue to think of different structures for interventions that could be made. And so I figured I just would start the discussion. I'll take the prerogative of being given a few minutes to start digging in and asking some questions. And so, one of the things I noticed is you used a lot of examples where essentially the antithesis of what we'd want, the meta-narrative being used to be divisive by leaders, whether it was Hungarian or whether it was in our own country, basically with dehumanizing narratives and other things being promulgated by senior influential leaders, is not only common, but it's sort of frequent. And so, have you guys thought about how your interventions can function, in a Colombia where the government's trying to get its peace deal to work, so you'll have a lot of support from authorities, right? And versus how it might apply in situations that are less clear-cut, where basically you might have leadership that's not supportive or that is actually exacerbating negative stereotypes, exacerbating intergroup conflicts, us and them kind of thinking, and sort of doing the opposite with the opposite on the underlying psychology of what you're trying to do.
Yeah. Well, I think Colombia is actually interesting because they, last year they had their elections and they elected in a president who's opposed to the peace deal. So it's a very interesting situation because they have a number of different governmental organizations that are just cruising right ahead with their mandate,
right?
Like the Colombian Truth Commission. They're still going ahead, but the kind of head of the government is basically squashing it. So it's really uncertain where it's going to go from here. But I think I've been thinking about that a lot as the government transitions over, and also realizing that there's a bit of a value judgment here, right? I'm trying to, this intervention is trying to promote peace, and that's kind of a judgment, right? I'm judging that to be a good thing. Mm-hmm. And I think the one thing that has made me feel much better about this and more removed is that the meta-perceptions that I'm combating, the meta-perceptions are just wrong, right? So they're misperceptions. I'm not trying to convince somebody that they like someone more than they actually do.
Right.
I'm not trying to, all I'm trying to do is correct a bias, right? So correct an erroneous assumption. Right? And that makes me feel less like I'm kind of influencing the group by trying to tell them what to do. And that makes me feel a little bit more comfortable doing this regardless of the value judgments, whether they align or not with the government.
So essentially you're saying that there's a meta perception, it's inaccurate. If you hear from the other group, they actually don't think what you think they think, and so that is simply a factual, it's exposing people to a different reality than what's in their heads. It's not saying support or don't support a government position. Yeah,
and I think there's an ethic to this also, that I felt as a scientist that when I was doing these interviews with the FARC members, number one, I couldn't tell them the questions beforehand, right? So I didn't give them the questions beforehand. I didn't allow, we got permission of the FARC leadership to just randomly ask FARC members. So they didn't give us who we spoke to. We just said, hey, would you be willing to talk to us? They couldn't watch each other's interviews before giving their own. And also we did the same thing with the villagers and the police and the NGO members, right? So I think that part of it is important also, that you make sure you give people the truth, mm-hmm. right? That you're if it turned out that FARC members didn't want to integrate at all,
that would have come out.
Yeah, I couldn't run this intervention, right? You have to find the meta-perception that doesn't match reality, right? But I think that's one of the really nice things, is that we humans have a negativity bias with respect to metaperceptions. That is, we think other groups think worse of us than they actually do.
So you'll
and
often-
it's true all over the place. So like with American political partisans, right? Democrats and Republicans hate each other, right? They dehumanize each other. But they hate and dehumanize each other half as much as they think the other side does, right? And then they're in agreement, right? So Democrats think that Republicans kind of rate them a certain level on the feeling thermometer scale and the dehumanization scale, and they do, but just not nearly as much as they think they do. And this is true for every group we've looked at. Muslim youth in Kenya think that the anti-terrorism police dislike them much more than they actually do, and dislike Muslims much more than they actually do. And the anti-terrorism police think that the Muslim youth hate them much more than they actually do, right? So the misperceptions, the nice thing is that we all collectively hold this bias. We can kind of be assured that our negative meta-perceptions, which are driving conflict, are wrong, are overblown, and are therefore able to be corrected. And you can think about this in so many situations, right? Like the Nigerian herder who takes his cattle onto the place he's always been taking his cattle, and all of a sudden there's a fence there, right? He has a meta-perception that the farmer there doesn't like him, put up the fence because of him, whereas the farmer just acquired, artificial fertilizer and now is fertilizing their land with the artificial fertilizer and put up the fence so that the wildlife doesn't come in, right? So. And then that sets them off that, it turns out that the farmer happens to be Christian and the herder happens to be Muslim. And now you have a religious conflict that was started by a meta-perception, right? By an erroneous perception about the other side. And so I think this happens all the time. And the fact that we've been able to correct it so relatively easily is just really encouraging to me.
Yeah, you mentioned one thing about this. You said you support peace. That's a value judgment essentially in that particular context, right? Yeah. Ending the conflict is a good, and of course the corollary to that is justice for the victims of the conflict, right? So right now, for example, in Afghanistan, which I'm working on for USIP, one of the big questions is, will non-Taliban Afghans view a peace agreement as rewarding the people who've been killing them for all this time, and not rewarding the people who have been on the other side, and thereby, much like in Colombia, have an adverse reaction to some sort of future peace agreement. How do you in your research see that kind of dynamic?
Yeah, I mean that's a tricky one. Like you said, it's in Colombia as well. This perception that FARC is being let off the hook.
Right, they're getting rewarded.
Yeah, one thing that. So I definitely don't have an answer to this yet, but one thing that did come up from these interviews was, and I don't know if this applies to Afghanistan, but I started realizing in hearing from these FARC members that a lot of them joined FARC because they had a family member who was killed. And so I started asking them, wait a second, why are you supporting peace? Have you ever received justice for your loss? And I think it was very interesting to me to turn it around in that direction. And if I had more time, I'd be curious to see how Colombians would respond to flipping it around and seeing that most of the FARC members had lost loved ones and none of them had received justice, and yet here they were supporting a peace treaty that doesn't have anything about them getting any kind of justice for their loss. And I think it's also interesting because the Colombians that seem to be most opposed to the peace deal are the ones who are not as directly affected.
Right, the ones who haven't suffered as much. Yeah. A little of that remove. Colette, I'm going to turn it over to you to both ask questions if you want to, and then also moderate any other discussion going forward. Thanks so much for facilitating all of this.
No, and thank you, Vikram, Vikram was the partner in crime for helping to organize this and coming forward with the idea of bringing together this group and bringing Emile here. So thank you, Vikram. Thank you, Vikram.
Yeah, thank you, Vikram.
Okay, thank you, Vikram, for being a partner in crime and organizing this and capitalizing on your long-term relationship since preschool, a very deep and important relationship, and helping us to bring Emile here, and thank you. And also for kicking off the question answer. So now I'd like to open up the floor. I think what I will do, we have about 25 minutes. We have a good amount of time. So if you could, I'm going to just kind of go around the room and just raise your hand as you see me scanning the room, and we'll take 3 at a time so that Emile can then respond, and then we'll move on to the next set. I knew you did before I even started. You look like you had a very important question.
All right.
Perfect.
Well, actually, I don't have a question. I was cautious at first because I thought I'd get some like criticism. And then right at the end of your talk, that the criticism part, you caught it and you took care of it. So I think this is more kind of cautionary, just to or something to maybe keep stored away and might be useful. So I was thinking a lot about when you said the old Albert contact stuff only accounts for 4% of the variance, and I think that that's a lot more of the variance than you were letting on. So complex things like behavior have lots of influences. There isn't, so my fear at first was, oh no, he's going to have the panacea, the golden bullet, and so that's you assured me that that's not the problem. So if we think about something like schizophrenia, so we get into, so there's a complex disorder, and people are looking for the genetic basis, and we know that genes play a lot in schizophrenia. And what we're finding is that there isn't a schizophrenic gene or a gene for schizophrenia. There's a whole bunch of genes. Each one is responsible for a very small amount of variance. Most, less than 4%, is what the story is right now. So these little influences, you can I see a parallel that we have all of these little influences, but they integrate, they multiply, they work together, they interact. So finding these little pieces and trying to fix these little pieces, I think is probably a good strategy, and not put all our money in one basket. So I guess that's not really a question, but that's a comment.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point.
One quick thing, just for the video and for people to hear, I just want to do a one-sentence point for Emile, just so people can hear, because they wouldn't have been able to hear the question. But just the comment about the complexity and the multitude of factors that can play into an outcome, especially when you're dealing with the brain and the nervous system and life experiences, and the concern about if we try to find the one magic switch, that could be a difficult area, that's not the reality. So I just want to summarize that for the tape. Great.
Yeah, I think the point is well taken, and I think, maybe I overdid the criticism of contact, but I think it's just because, to use your analogy with many genes affecting schizophrenia, you don't want to put 90% of your effort for 60 years on one gene if it's a bunch of genes that are causing this. So I think that's my caution, is just that since we put so much of our focus on contact programs, I feel like it's prevented us from innovating with new programs. Yeah.
When you ask a question, just press the speak button and then turn off the jump. Thank you.
Hi, Emile.
Hi.
So, white nationalism in the U.S., can you break that down for us vis-a-vis your presentation, particularly in terms of the interventions, the types of interventions that you outlined, and where you might even begin to start in the U.S., given the scale and size of the problem?
Yeah, well, I think white nationalism is a great example of it. Has anybody seen American History X? I think that the writers in that film did an incredible job of writing. The main character is a white nationalist who goes through a conversion, And he's based off a guy in Philadelphia who actually went through this conversion. I actually last summer got to talk to a number of former white supremacists, right, who were deeply committed to the movement, but then got out of the movement. And my question to them was, what was it that got you out of the movement? Like, why did you leave? And the interesting thing about them is these guys don't just reject this one argument that was made in the movement. They now reject everything, right? So, and what caused them to reject it was one moment that caused them to really question one of these things they had been told is true, right? So one guy coming out of prison with all these swastikas is hired by a Jewish furniture maker. And when his first paycheck comes, he's thinking, guy's gonna stiff me, right? It's consistent with the narrative, right? This house of cards of all these ideas he had about Americans, about Jews, right? It was all built up like this. And the first paycheck, his boss just gave him exactly what he was deserved. And that was it. That was the thing that knocked out the first card. And then the rest of it, in pretty quick order, came tumbling down. And here I am talking with him a couple of years later, and he's heading an organization that pulls other white supremacists out of the organization, right? So it was a really kind of small intervention for him that caused this dramatic shift. And so, you know, a lot of you know, and they would say things like, it's really hard for them to go back and read the Bible without interpreting Bible passages the way they did in their white nationalist Bible study groups, right? Or music. And that blew me away. I had no idea that they could have very specific interpretations of the Bible that would be consistent with their white nationalist ideology, but that's what happens. And I think that is really common for an ideology. Like, it's an ideology that has many different pieces. And if a number of these pieces are erroneous in some way, right? Or maybe the trick is to try to find the pieces that are the most logically inconsistent, right? And go after those pieces. And if you can get them to say, wait a second, that's actually not right, or there's something wrong about my assumption there, that can be the type of thing that starts, you know, shaking this whole facade. At least that's what the former white nationalists said, and also what this research seems to be implying, right? That even people who holds kind of are strong in these beliefs, like the collective blame hypocrisy intervention, that intervention works best for people who are the most extreme, right? And so that, you know, maybe it is one of those times where we're like, wait a second, yeah, that's kind of like logically inconsistent to blame one group for this action but not blame it. So I think, you know, we know a lot of the things that prop up, the specific beliefs that prop up white nationalism, right? And we see like what fuels it. I saw the hashtag white genocide from the, you know, redistribution of farms in South Africa to give some kind of reparations to the black South Africans for all the land that was stolen from them during apartheid, right? Hashtag white genocide. I even saw it after the Star Wars movie, right? That had a well-publicized diverse cast. Hashtag white genocide, right? So all these little things are built into this whole structure. Yeah.
1, 2.
Yeah, and 2, and then 3.
And 4.
Sorry. 4. Lillian's 4. Okay.
Thanks. Hi, Kyle Dietrich from Equal Access. So we've had the pleasure of working with Beyond Conflict and have been thinking along these lines. We're definitely not specialists. I think my question, to just be specific, is how to do this in sort of a broad scale, like broadly disseminating messages. So not one-on-one in a sort of randomized control trial, but using mass media, social media. Obviously, it's very effective at dividing and dehumanizing and mobilizing those sentiments. But do you have examples of doing that effectively? We're actually designing a sort of a pilot right now with Karen at Beyond Conflict in Nigeria and doing other similar work in other regions. But I think the science is not our strength always, and so it'd be good to just hear where, if anywhere, where and how it's been successful to do that at a, again, sort of more scalable mass media case study.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's, I think the ideal is to have a partnership from the very beginning where you have practitioners and scientists working together on a problem, because then you can have the handoffs, right? When it's on the development stage where the scientists are trying to figure out, okay, what perception should we be combating? Well, the practitioners have much more information on that. They can feed them, oh, these perceptions are really strong in Colombia towards FARC, and these perceptions, and then the scientists can take that on, test them, say, oh, okay, yeah, we want these perceptions. And then once they develop something that works, then they hand it off to the practitioners who then take the lead on disseminating. I don't know how to make a viral media campaign, right? That's outside of my wheelhouse, but it's totally in the wheelhouse of a partner who I could have, right?
But
Yeah.
if the questions you're asking spark something at the individual level, there's no reason to believe it wouldn't, whether it's through a fictionalized drama series that reinforces the same message or a talk show with the right kind of credible voices, that it can't accomplish something similar, right? So my question is, have you tried that, using a similar methodology in sort of a broader scale, like a media campaign or something?
No, I mean, the closest I'm getting right now is we're just about to, so Colombia has this rule that the feature films have to be preceded by a featurette, a 7-minute featurette, and this is to foster, young filmmakers, young Colombian filmmakers, right, to support them. So what we're doing right now is turning this video I just showed you into a 7-minute mini documentary that'll then be shown before feature-length films. So that's a way to, now all of a sudden you have your dissemination up to, tens of thousands of people. And, the vote in Colombia was determined by 45,000 people in a 13 million voting. So you're, what's that?
Like the U.S. elections.
Yeah. So you're starting to get, now you're starting to approach the level where it could actually cause some shift. And so that's the closest I've gotten. I'm now kind of with this model, for example, I'm trying to develop this, an analogy for how past injustices don't just stop when you stop the injustice, but they perpetuate with an analogy using Monopoly. So like if you have player from Team A and Team B playing under totally different rules, then one person's going to win after, playing for 30 minutes. And if you have a new person step in, but the board remains the same, then new people coming in and playing, the outcome is going to be the same, right? This player has 90% of the properties, and this player has just $40. How can they possibly? So it's, I feel like there are ways that we can develop media together in collaboration, and then, that next step of what you do afterwards, that's what I really need help on. So if anybody is interested,
They're interested.
I'm all game.
So it's a
Yeah.
science, if you get it validated, then you do PSAs or whatever. That would seem like a way to go.
I think I said it
Yeah.
random. That just made me think about what you were talking about. So
Your mic.
Radio Lab. Sorry.
I didn't do mine.
Hello. Okay, so I just heard, like maybe a couple of months ago on Radiolab, where I learned a lot of things, that they are advertising or making publicly available interviews of former FARC members or kind of the folks who were kidnapped by the FARC to show like the communities how the people that they were being held captive by were actually very human and treated them very well. And I think they've required like the families to approve that these become publicly available, and that's actually been quite impactful as like part of this whole like trying to see the other side, just kind of what you did here, but that's on the radio. I mean,
yeah, so this is amazing. This is exactly the type of thing that I get really excited about.
Me too.
Because I feel like there are, that's a great intuition, right?
I mean, TBD, but they're starting to do it, and apparently the family members on both sides are okay with it. I mean, I don't know. You can ask the Radiolab people. But, you know, it's just one other way of kind of making it mainstream. But I think Colombia and the visibility it has and kind of the fact that it's homogenous and to some extent, I know they're indigenous languages, but a lot of these folks speak Spanish, even in the FARC, makes this kind of thing possible, right? So where it's not possible in places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Burma, Bangladesh, the Sahel, et cetera. So kind of where I'm thinking like I'm jumping all over the map thinking where can we do this next, you got to have a lot of those factors in play to make something like this really make sense, you know? Anyway, sorry, cut.
Hi, so I'm curious where you're actually pulling your data from, if it's both from international affairs studies as well as psych studies, since they focus on different variables and ignore others. For instance, in psych, obviously, you'd be focusing on Pearson's R and R square, but in international affairs statistics, we're actually told to ignore that.
It's all psych and neuroscience that I'm focused on now, but you know, ideally, I would love to have outcome measures from other fields too. Poli-sci would be great. Yeah.
Lillian.
I wanted to ask about your collective blame, hypocrisy intervention. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about the individuals who participated in the intervention, how you were able to identify them, kind of follow up with them, because I'm just thinking through how you would maybe apply that in a programmatic space, like how representative were those who participated of potentially some of the beneficiaries we would be working with in other country contexts, and particularly talking about the US interventions that you spoke about.
In the U.S., the studies that I did in the U.S., those were all with Mechanical Turk participants. And for people who aren't in the know, Mechanical Turk is an Amazon service. It was originally developed for product testing. So like Colgate could, you know, put out there the 3 different packaging schemes that they were thinking of and just crowdsource from people online to see which one people liked. And social scientists jumped in and said, oh, hey, you have hundreds of thousands of people who are, you know, across demographics in the US who are willing to do something for 10 or 15 minutes. Hey, can I have them fill out a survey? And so this is a way to get, you know, large amounts of data from a pretty diverse sample in the US. In other countries, there are like surveying companies that basically do this service also. There are also these services in the US like NORC, which will get you an actual representative sample of Americans. So we use all of these services to do this, but they've all been online because, and I've been biased towards that just because I want to make sure it's something that can be scaled up. And so I want to, you know, make sure that I can easily deliver it to a lot of people, and that it's, again, hopefully complementary to more face-to-face approaches.
Leanne, and then Maria.
I'm going to tag team.
Go for it.
So I'm Leanne Erdberg. I'm here at the Institute, and Maria and I are working with Mike from your lab on some survey research in Algeria, hopefully. My question's on meta-perceptions, though, because as you were speaking about them, I had perhaps a moment that other people have where like, well, if they're always wrong, can I just correct for the future of all my future meta-perceptions and just try and break them down a notch? So the next time somebody asks, like, well, what does Mike think about my outfit today? I'd be like, oh, he probably hates it. And be like, oh, he might just lightly dislike it. Just try and be predictive about our own meta-perceptions if we're always off. But But does that actually happen? Are we actually that self-aware that we can take this type of data and information about how we process things and then change our future appreciation of these same trends in different situations?
Well, I'm not sure if correcting for meta-perceptions exactly. I don't see why not. So one of the big questions I had going into neuroscience was how much control do we have over our own brains? And the answer is a lot, right? That our brains just aren't just able to change. Like down to the subcellular level, that's how they are designed. Right? Every single connection in the brain is kind of potentiated. It's not a static structure that's cemented together that if under the right conditions you can uncement and change a little bit. Every connection is like a roiling cauldron ready to move and change almost immediately. And that reality, I think, really changed my perception of how our brains, like the potential of our brains. Like, it's just extraordinary. I mean, it's extraordinary that we can, like, that people like monks and Sufis and this crazy guy, Wim Hof, can, like, consciously control their own body temperature so that this guy can hike Everest in shorts, right? That's something that normally your mind controls that, but it's an unconscious part of your brain that you don't have conscious access to. But they just, through training, gain conscious access to that. And then this guy can say, hey, instead of removing blood from my toes, I'm going to shunt blood down there so I don't get frostbite. And he can just do it consciously. And if you can consciously control your body temperature, then, like, consciously controlling your racism should be much easier, right? I mean, so that's
quote of the day.
I think that's the reality that the brain is designed to be dynamic. It's designed to change at every level. I think that just gives me so much hope for what we're capable of doing. And we now have some really nice examples of that there are some biases that once you are aware of them, you inoculate yourself against experiencing them. So one of the things I would really like to do is, well, that's low-hanging fruit. Let's identify all of the psychological biases that you can inoculate people against just by educating them about it, and start there, and then go after the harder ones. But I think it would be a really interesting approach.
And thank you, Leanne, for raising that, because my thought when you first said it was, okay, even if I could bring the temperature down to how much Mike doesn't like my jacket or dress, that's still he doesn't like it. So I was trying to think it's a little...
I have zero qualms with anyone's outfit in the room.
But on more important things in our attire, is like the things that we're dealing with that become drivers of conflict and lead to violence. So even if there's some level of it there, it's still boiling, ready to be tapped into, should it be manipulated or in other ways. So this is where I liked your question, because how low can you get it if one's aware through education and things like that? That is where it's very exciting. Where can we shift that individually?
Yeah,
and,
I think with meta-perceptions, you probably... So there's another interesting thing about meta-perceptions, which is at the individual level, we have a positivity bias. So this is like one example of this is curse of knowledge, right? We think that other people share our views, and this is what makes it so difficult to write trivia questions, right? Because you're like, oh, everybody will know that, but of course they don't, right? They don't have access to what's in your mind. So I think you can correct for this. You can correct for curse of knowledge, right? You know about it, and you're like, okay, that's probably too hard. And you can maybe correct for the negativity bias in intergroup meta-perceptions by saying, okay, well, gosh, do Muslims really hate us, right, for our freedoms? And then the Pew survey, you can go and look at a Pew survey. Okay, well, what do Muslims really think about Americans when they're surveyed? And you can find, oh, well, that's very different than I would assume. So yeah, and there are even specific, like I said, there are specific biases that once you learn what the bias is, you can inoculate yourself against experiencing it.
I have a quick sort of follow-up to that, which is just curious if you've disaggregated any of your studies by age, right? Because it's sort of a common trope that we have to target the youth, right? They're going to be the ones that are going to do this. I mean, did you find that some interventions were more successful for certain segments of populations than others based on age?
Let's see.
Or, to sort of beat back the myth that, somebody who, a 60-year-old from the Shankill area of Belfast is going to be much more hardened on some of these issues than maybe a 15-year-old.
Yeah, it's a good question. Nothing jumped out, obviously, at with the collective blame hypocrisy work, either in the U.S. or in Spain. So it certainly wasn't the case that older people couldn't change. Yeah, and beyond that, I didn't look finer grained than that.
So we're running out of time, so we're going to close with Maria's question.
Oh, dear.
So it better be important.
Okay, I'm Maria Steffen. I work here on nonviolent action, and I'm working with Leanne on this project. I guess my question is having to do with when changes in meta-perception lead to behavioral shifts. And what do we know about if your bias is lessened, what actually prompts a shift in behavior or actual action? Because I'm thinking too, like this is the sociological aspect of it, is if you see like someone else, your friend changing their mind about something and taking action, you're going to be more likely to do it yourself, I would imagine. So I guess it's the collective action part of the question of whether your research touches on any of that aspect of brain shift to action.
Yeah, well, let me make a couple of points. So one point is that's the right question to ask, and that's how you want to interrogate the measures you're using to evaluate success. And this is one area that, that frustrated me a little bit when I first kind of came out of the practice world and into the science world, was realizing that there's such a big divide between the two worlds, and that psychology, the incentive structure of psychology and social sciences is towards theoretical novelty. And so it's finding the next shiny object and not determining whether that's actually relevant to real conflict. So I'm gonna maybe do something unwise, which is to go after some specific research, right? Like I'm sure that a lot of people have heard about the implicit association test, right? Like this is a measure that just measures your reaction time to get kind of a gut feeling of negativity towards another group, which is great. It's such a neat idea. I would love for it to work. I've been trying to get it to work for so long. Okay, fine. I can measure people's how quickly they associate negative things with this group, but it never predicts anything, right? And I did this with a group of Israelis, for example, right? A bunch of Israelis come into the lab. I give them this implicit association test. There's all sorts of variability. There are 3 Israelis who are Palestinian peace activists. Their implicit association test is no different than the other Israelis, right? And my point is, if it can't predict that behavior, then great, it's kind of theoretically interesting, but it's practically useless. Right? And so the question you're asking is, it's forcing some validity out of the measure. Like, is this valid in the real world? And I think that's the research that we scientists have to do that is incentivized right now against. And that's something that drives me absolutely nuts. And this is when I showed the practitioners and scientists, that the scientists, I feel like they have to develop interventions and test them in the real world. But the other half of that is that science has to be informed by conflict. It has to be science that's relevant to real world situations, or else what the hell are we doing? And so I'm hopeful, especially because the younger generation of scientists is really amenable to this perspective, they really want, and I think they're just looking around at the world right now and thinking, what the hell are we doing in the lab? Like, Rome is burning around our ears, and we're concerned about these, statistical significance tests about, or like proving a theory, but I don't know if it's actually, so they seem to be amenable to this, and that gives me a lot of hope. But the pointed question was, have you validated the meta-perceptions against actual behavior? So searching for the right behavior is always the challenge. The behaviors that I've been able to look at are like, can I convince people that they're signing an actual petition to get Obama to sign a peace treaty with Iran? Okay, they're signing a petition. That's the closest I've gotten to a behavior. It's not terribly satisfying to me, but, and I would love to have things like, are they committing violence or not? But that's a really difficult thing to measure in people, like in the real world. But if anybody has actual behaviors that they can measure, I would love to get together and try to figure out how to do this.
The easiest would be participation in protest.
Actual participation in protest, yeah.
But anyways,
Mhm.
Thank you, Emile, very much for your time today, for being very clear and honest and practical, trying to find a better way to help bring down the temperature individually, but also, as you mentioned, in the world, which is much, much needed. So thank you for all of your work and your commitment to this process. Thank you, Vikram, for your concluding remarks and getting us started in all of the questions and answers that then was sparked around the room. And thank you to everyone who participated, who asked questions. And if you'd like to, we will have this on to review it again. We will have it on the website as soon as it can get processed. So thank you, and have a great rest of the day, everyone.
Yeah, and I'll stick around too.
And Emile, as he said, will stick around if there was a burning question that was just prompted by some of the last discussion.
I'd love to